Hello, listeners, and welcome to another episode of Cognitive Dissidence. As usual, I'm your host. I'm Jacob Shapiro. I'm a partner and the director of geopolitical analysis at Cognitive Investments. Joining me for our weekly recap on geopolitics and markets is Rob. I want to apologize for getting this podcast out a little later than normal, and I'm sorry the cadence has been off the last couple of weeks. I actually thought this week was going to be fine. We were going to get back to recording on Thursday and posting on Friday, but to be frank, it has been a very, very difficult week for me personally. I even feel a little self-conscious about recording today because I have not been as on top of things as I usually am, just because I've had a lot to deal with personally this week. I have had time to go through the U.S. and China and the Xi-Biden summit. That's why we spend so much time talking about that in the conversation. I'm fine. My family's fine. If you're worried about that, I appreciate the concern, but I do just want to say, if you have people out there in your lives who are struggling, or if they seem off to you, call them, let you know you love them. Take care of the people you love and hold them close. I always say that at the end of the podcast, but for me personally this week, that message is more clear than ever. So take care of the people you love and hold close the people that are really dear to you and check in with them and make sure that they're okay. Other than that, I'm not sure if there's going to be a Thanksgiving episode or not next week, but we do have some interesting content already backloaded, and you will probably hear from me with a short episode about what's going on with Argentina's elections next week, unless Massa just wins and it's completely boring. You can email me at jacob@cognitive.investments. We've been getting lots of emails lately and lots of new listeners. I read everything, and it may take me a week or two, but I do reply to everything. So thanks in advance for reaching out to me. And if you haven't left a rating or a review, let me know. You can also talk to me or email me about our wealth management services, research services, or about me speaking at an event. I've been doing a lot of that lately as well. So enough ado from me. Cheers and see you out. This clip of this Senator Mullen from Oklahoma challenging a Teamsters boss to a fight during the hearing of the Senate Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions Committee. Did you watch the video?
I didn't. I saw that you were commenting on it. What do you think?
First of all, I literally can't stop watching it. It's like watching a car crash happen over and over and over again. And every piece of it is perfect. They're not willing to curse at each other, but they're willing to throw down in the Senate room. Bernie Sanders is the chair of the committee, which is absolutely perfect. So you hear him telling the senator to calm down, and his little hand is like flapping up and down in the video, going up and down. Oh, sit, I can't do the Bernie very well, but you're a United States senator. Sit down. And by the way, drugs are too high. Anyway, I just... But the thing I wanted to say was that in our research chat, everybody was like, wow, this really shows that United States politics is declining and we're having fights and all these other things. And it's like, well, no, actually, the Sumner affair, go back and do your U.S. history. There's actually a long history of now, this was not senator on senator or congressman on congressman action. This was challenging a Teamsters boss. Anyway, that's my lead-in. How's it going?
It seems like a common theme where every week we're talking about how things are going to hell in a handbasket in different varieties and flavors. But I suppose that's...
I just feel really bad for like American comedians and political satire and SNL. Like, how are you supposed to do anything when like we don't have to go down that rabbit hole. There's two big things to talk about this week. There is U.S.-China relations, some pretty big developments there. And then we're going to get wonky and talk a little bit more specifically about investments, due in part to all the wonkiness and seesaw nature of markets and markets in general. And I'm sure I will find a very elegant way to segue them together. But the way to start off, I think, is something that we've been ahead on quite a bit. If you fast forward, if you rewind about a year, people were talking about Nancy Pelosi visiting Taiwan and these extremely harsh tech restrictions on China to include not just semiconductors, cloud services companies. Who can forget the spy balloon? Go back and listen to my angry diatribe about the spy balloon earlier this year. But then an article appeared in the Washington Post citing sources connected to the White House, and it was all about how Biden didn't want to be the president who put the United States into another Cold War, and how he thought that the U.S.-China relationship was on the wrong trajectory and he wanted to change things. And we identified that at the time and said, okay, that's something. That's probably from Biden. That's the way that he likes to leak. That's the way that he does things. Like, we should see a real change in the bilateral relationship. And boy, have we. You've had multiple high-level meetings between both sides. You had Janet Yellen and her mushrooms and the rainbow appearing when she landed. But this week we got the we got the culmination, which was the Xi Jinping, Joe Biden meeting on the side of the APEC summit in Woodside, California, where my aunt and uncle live. Shout out to Aunt Kate and Uncle Peter. Hope you guys enjoyed all the traffic that happened because of all the shit that's happening in your neighborhood. But they walked away with two concrete things. So China's agreed to cut down on sort of people in China exporting precursors that go to Mexico for creating fentanyl that then gets put into the United States. This is a big hot button topic for the White House, and they're declaring a win there. They also agreed to the resumption of direct military to military contacts. So about a year ago, military to military contacts were broken up. And so the Chinese and US militaries didn't have a hotline to each other. And in the context of everything that's been happening in South China Sea, not just with Taiwan, but especially with the Philippines and China, arguing over these shoals and rocks and abandoned ships like that where nobody lives, but it's a major problem in the relationship between the two of them. Now you've got military to military contacts sort of going back together. So that's sort of the lay of the land. How do you want to tackle understanding this, Rob? Because I don't think that it's a long-term change, but it certainly changes things in the short term in U.S.-China relations, and it's something we've been talking about here for a good 10 to 12 months.
I think it's worth talking about these issues through the same prism that I always try to talk about them, which is, what is Mr. Market saying? And I saw that you posted, there was some commentary about, the risk premium in China is now gone, and, this is a huge deal. This marks such a major change, and you would express some skepticism about that on the Knowledge platform. And it seems like Mr. Market agrees with you, because Hong Kong stocks and Chinese A-share stocks are both making new lows, at least multiple year lows on the chart that I'm looking at, relative to the US market in the last couple of weeks. So apparently Mr. Market didn't get the memo that this is a sea change and everything going on, and is treating it more like business as usual, like you say.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot to dive into here, and I don't think it's business as usual. And I was kind of shocked. I'm going to have cousin Marco on the podcast soon, because he talked about on Twitter about how this sort of got rid of the risk of U.S.-China confrontation over Taiwan. And, that's sort of a tricky thing to say, because I don't think there was any risk of U.S.-China confrontation over Taiwan. I've said over and over and over again, China doesn't have the military forces to pull it off. And that's not the way China operates. They're going to use the Hong Kong playbook. So they're going to try and isolate Taiwan completely politically. They're going to make Taiwan completely economically dependent on mainland China. And then when nobody else cares anymore, that's the moment where they will flip the switch and they'll try to integrate them. And there have been some interesting developments in Taiwan just in the last week or two. All the opposition parties in Taiwan are going to band together against the DPP. And in polls, that suggests they might win. And maybe you get a restart, or a reset, I should say, on Taiwan-China relations. While everybody's freaking out about, oh my God, World War III in the South China Sea, China is brain draining Taiwan, all their engineers and all their smart people, giving them cushy jobs, cushy living conditions inside of China to come there. So that's the thing to worry about with that. But the idea that, and now that there's an agreement between these two sides about fentanyl and military, now the risk premium is off the table. The risk premium's not off the table at all. I do think the next 12 months going into the election will be good. And some part of me can't help but think maybe China's worried about that election. Maybe China's worried that they're going to get a Republican who's going to be much more hawkish than Biden will be. Or maybe they're worried that Biden, once he gets, if Biden wins again, or if a Democrat wins, that there will be no reason for the United States to compromise at that point, that there'll be 12 more months into Build Back Better, establishing more sovereignty and reshoring supply chains and things like that. So maybe they think now's the time to make a deal. So there might be some opportunity over the next 12 months, but I really don't think it changes anything in the aggregate.
Yeah.
And maybe that's a boring take. I mean, I want to get a little deeper into it. Which is to say, I want to get to the core of the disagreement between the United States and China. Why are these countries so opposed to each other? And why are they on this trajectory? Because if you read the Chinese readout of the Biden-Xi meeting, China is saying all the things that all of us would probably hope in our minds, that China does not seek to displace the United States, that there is room for both countries on the global stage, that if the countries go after each other in this competitive way, that it's going to be bad. Reports along the sidelines were that China didn't even want to call the relationship competitive, had to compromise and keep in some language about it being a competitive relationship, because the United States wanted to call out that it was competitive because it didn't want to seem soft. But for me, I was looking through a lot of the U.S. coverage and the Chinese coverage, and the thing that sticks out to me is even in the U.S. reporting on the deal, like for instance, there's a good New York Times article that sort of sums up everything about the meeting and what they ate and what they did and how it goes. And there's this line that I keep on tripping over. And the line is, or it gets about halfway through about, now China needs the United States and it's going to make these compromises, blah, blah, blah. And then it says, but few doubt when he can, Xi Jinping will reignite his effort to displace the United States as the most skilled military, technological, and economic power in the world. And I think that's the problem right there. I think the problem is that you have the United States now defines its geopolitical interests, not in terms of protecting the United States or security of the United States, but of maintaining preeminence in the world. So as listeners probably know, I think we're already in a multipolar era, but the United States is stuck on the way to preserve U.S. interests is to be unipolar, is to be the strongest power in the world. And not only is that not realistic, I think it's not even true anymore. Whereas China, I don't think China wants to be the preeminent skilled military, technological, and economic power in the world. There's a reason that China is so cautious about entering formal defense relationships. There is a reason that China is so pragmatic in a lot of its different relations. I think what China wants is to be master of its own fate. It wants to be independent. It doesn't want outside powers to be able to dictate terms to China. And this is why Taiwan is such a big issue for them, because as long as Taiwan is not a part of China, the centuries of humiliation, if you will, are ongoing. It's a reminder that China is not even master of the territories that it thinks it controls. I don't know if there's a really good metaphor for this in the United States. Let's say that Rhode Island or something was not in the Union and was being supported by some American enemy or some American rival or something like that. And the United States kept on trying to get Rhode Island back and it couldn't do it. I don't know. I mean, the metaphors kind of break down, but that I think is the crux of the issue. And I can already hear some of the listeners who want to get mad and write in and say, well, Jacob, come on. They said the same thing about Nazi Germany, didn't they? All it was, so we'll give them the Sudetenland, give them this, and we'll give them that. And eventually Germany kept taking more and more and more, and we got to World War II. And maybe that's true. Maybe I'm either A, naive about China's intentions, or B, I'm not understanding that as China ascends, not just global value chains, but global geopolitical power chains, that its interests will become more expansive, and that the definition of China's interests mean that it will have to become a stronger power than the United States, and we'll have to muscle the United States out of all these places that the United States is the dominant power. But I really do think at its core, China views the world as multipolar, and the United States still views the world as unipolar and is clinging on to that. And that is why I think in the end, China is probably going to be more successful here in the short term, because they have a more accurate grasp of what's going on in the world than I think the United States government. That's right this second.
And how important do you think the form of China's government compared to other, major independent powers in a multipolar world? How important is that in terms of shaping this response by the United States? Like, why aren't we all up in arms about Ethiopia, throwing its weight around in East Africa? Or, obviously those are two different things because they're of vastly different scales and degrees of power. But my question is, to what extent does the ideological element play a role here, or is that overplayed?
I don't think the ideology plays a role here. The Cold War is over. Communism lost. Capitalism won. Look at the Chinese economy. Yes, it's sort of a state capitalist economy, and it has some aspects really of more national socialism than of communism, but that's not a communist country. You're right that the form of Chinese rule has been Marxist, all the various committees, and they have a materialistic view of the world. I don't mean in terms of, things, but I mean in a Marxist sort of perspective, how they interpret world history. But if you actually look at Chinese economic, go back and read Xi Jinping's speeches from when he first ascended power in China. He's talking about supply side reform. You could put his speeches next to speeches of Ronald Reagan, and the economic policy would roughly be the same. So I don't think there's anything ideological here. I think for China, And I think this has actually always been true for China. It has never been about communism or capitalism. It has always been about nationalism. And it has always been about, China got incredibly weak and broke apart, and all of these different external actors, not just the United States, but Japan and Russia and the British, all took advantage of China, and China wants to be in a position where it's never taken advantage of ever again. It's why the very simplistic dichotomy within China itself, if you go back to the Chinese Civil War, people often talk about how it's the communists versus the nationalists. The communists were still nationalist. Mao still believed in a modern Chinese nation state, and I really do think that's the lens through which China views the world. And honestly, Rob, that's an interesting point, because almost every single U.S. foreign policy failure of, let's call it, the last 80 years, whether it's in Korea or in Vietnam or in Iraq, I think has been, in some ways, the United States thinking a conflict is ideological and not understanding that, actually, it's really more interest-based, or it's really more about nationalism. Nobody cares about sort of what economic philosophy you embrace and things like that. So that's maybe a bit of a long-winded answer. I maybe even sidestepped your question. Did I answer what the form of Chinese government does?
No, I think it does. And at the end of the day, who do you think? I know I'm sort of just tossing these up to you but I really am curious. Who do you think drives these ideological decisions or these policy decisions at the end? Is it the U.S. president? Is it the median voter? Is it interest groups in business or Congress? Like, who wants to pick a fight with China the most, and who's driving that forward, really, do you think?
I mean, that's a really interesting question. We'd have to break it down into a bunch of different parts. So the median voter, I think, and this is, Cousin Marco will talk till he's blue in the face about the median voter. That is an argument about the inequality created by globalization and the hollowing out of U.S. manufacturing to China because of globalization, that American workers felt used by China in a way and felt that their government had not done enough for them. And so you had this reflexive embrace in the 2016 election of Donald Trump, who was, who eventually became president and was the candidate for the Republican Party, a party that had been all about free trade for decades. And Donald Trump was not about free trade at all. I mean, and Hillary eventually became the nominee for the Democrats, but Bernie gave her a really good run for her money. And Bernie was the same in terms of sort of trade policy and thinking about globalization from that point of view. So there's obviously a current within the U.S. workforce that has been hurt by globalization, which doesn't see that, I get cheaper iPhones, whatever. I want a job. I want to be able to build a better life for my family. And now there's no jobs here in the United States unless I want to work at some, tech company and tweet a bunch of stuff online. So I think there's a groundswell of that within the U.S. electorate. I'll also say, though, I think there's a top-down element to this as well. If you look at polls about U.S. sentiment about China, sort of going back to 2015, 2016, most Americans don't get suspicious about China until their government starts talking about how China is a challenge. So I think sometimes the voters think, we're really leading the way, and maybe the voters do elect people who are more willing to use, there's a chicken and egg thing there. So the voters are electing people who are more willing to use the China issue as a cudgel, but maybe, that's the reason that they're there in the first place. But the polling, there's a lag in the polling sentiment, which it's only after a year or two of the top down, China's a threat, that U.S. sentiment starts to turn against China in general. And it's not like China has actually done anything. The only thing that China has done in the last, I guess there's two things. We could talk about Xinjiang or we could talk about Hong Kong. But the idea that these things are somehow different than what India is doing in Kashmir or Saudi Arabia and the Yemeni civil war, like something fundamentally different is going on there. And then I do think we're seeing right now the way that the U.S. executive has a freer hand when it comes to foreign policy than in just about any other element of U.S. governmental power. So most polling data in the United States suggests that the majority of the population is not cool with what the Biden administration is doing in terms of supporting Israel in its war with Hamas and in the Gaza Strip. And yet the Biden White House is saying, nope, this is what we're doing. And whether that's because that's what they think is best for U.S. interests and they don't care about what the U.S. electorate says, whether that's Biden is, in a world where it's the 1970s in his mind and he can't seem to update his programming to what's going on in the world. I mean, you can, depending on what your political bent is, you can sort of have your own interpretation there. So I guess the confusing thing about U.S. foreign policy in that regard is there is no one source, and it can change all the time. Whereas in China, it doesn't change that much, and it certainly hasn't changed since Xi Jinping became president. So that in some ways can create, a rigidity in Chinese policy, but it also creates predictability. And that's one of the reasons why we're heading into the end of the year. When I write my forecast, look ahead for 2024, I already have the first couple sentences in mind. The most serious geopolitical risk in the world right now is U.S. elections. Because the United States is completely unpredictable right now, and it is still relatively stronger than other powers, and we don't know what's going to happen. Whereas unless Xi Jinping gets hit by a bus tomorrow, we know exactly what's going to happen in China over the next 12.
But question, just to push back on that a little bit, because from my less informed view, it doesn't seem like policies with regard to foreign trade and a foreign economic policy have changed dramatically from one very different administration to the next. So one question I would have is, are those elements, even if everything else around, the different U.S. political parties is clearly very different, and they're telling different messages, and they're certainly not meeting in the middle by any measure, is the sphere of foreign policy going to be more stable just because the average voter just cares less about it, or it reflects certain fundamental constraints or goals of the country that don't change and aren't really up in the political, football? You know what I'm getting at? Because it doesn't seem like there's been a 180 in either direction. So is it really such a geopolitical risk from that perspective?
It is. And I'll tell you, most geopolitical analysts out there, this is one of the reasons I broke with George years ago now, because you're right. If, let's say, look at the transition from the Trump administration to the Biden administration, not a whole lot of change. Biden tried to change a couple of things around the edges, and even those things he was constrained from changing. If anything, what has changed is the tools. So instead of Section 302, they use some other tool. They want to use tech restrictions. They don't want to use tariffs. They want to use it's all which tools are you going to use to further the same goals. But the change from Obama to Trump was absolutely seismic. I mean, you go from Iran nuclear deal and stable balance of power in the Middle East to whatever Kushner was trying to create with the Arabs and the Turks and the Israelis, and trying to put that unholy alliance together. You go from complete support of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, trying to solidify U.S. trade ties and intellectual property rules with all of these up-and-coming countries in Southeast Asia, to that's gone, free trade is gone. And it wasn't just China that the United States went after. They went after countries like Vietnam. They went after Canada. They went after Europe. The United States literally changed the trajectory of probably German and European Union foreign policy in general, because they looked at the Trump administration and said, well, wow, if the U.S. can elect a government like that, we can't depend on the U.S. going forward for our security the way that we did in the past. And it really gave strength and voice to some of the things that France, and specifically Emmanuel Macron, has been talking about. In turn, nobody took that seriously until suddenly, oh wow, we really do have to sort of take that seriously. So I'm agreeing with you that the change is not that much. I think between Trump and Biden, that's really more about form. And although there are some ways that they were very different, and we can get into that if you want, but the change between Obama and Trump was absolutely seismic. And if you had that kind of shift back, I do think it could be that important.
And is that realistically in the cards, that there would be a shift back in that direction? I genuinely don't know enough to be able to say.
Yeah, I mean, the polling is pretty neck and neck. And if you had Trump, or you had a Republican president in there, I'm sure that they could reverse some of the things that the Biden administration is doing right now. I think, to your point, the bigger shift was that shift from where the Obama administration was still pushing free trade and was still pushing balance of power, and that has all changed. So maybe you're not going to get a shift that is that big, but sure, I mean, the unpredictability quotient is right there. What happens with U.S. relations with North Korea if Trump gets reelected, or if a Republican gets elected? What happens to U.S. relations with Mexico if Vivek somehow pulls a rabbit out of a hat? I mean, you start going down sort of the list of things that are really uncertain based on who might actually win. And it gets kind of scary. And scary is the wrong word. It gets volatile and it gets unpredictable. And my point is just, there's none of that with China. As long as Xi Jinping is healthy and well, like, Chinese foreign policy is not going to change. We know exactly what they're going to do. They've telegraphed exactly what they were going to do for 10 to 12 months, even though nobody's listened. I've been here banging on that. Yeah, they're going to compromise. They don't want to have this confrontation right now. And everybody's been telling me, oh, you're wrong. Like, they're going to invade Taiwan. It's World War III. It's like, nope. Sorry, now's not the time. They're also not going to collapse in a heap on themselves like Peter and everybody else says too. So I guess the ending answer to you is just think of it on a relative basis. Look at some of these other countries in the world and think about predicting their next 12 months versus how you're going to predict the next 12 months in the United States.
And do you think the same thing applies in the European context? Or do you think their motives and policies are more fundamentally stable than what we would see in the US?
I'm not sure that they're more fundamentally stable, but they have fewer options. They have more constraints. So European countries don't have the luxury of the United States getting to change on a dime and decide to do something completely different. Germany, for example, Germany has to find power sources so that it can heat its homes and get its export complex going through the winter. So that is going to require certain decisions, whereas the United States is still an embarrassment of riches. The United States is energy secure if it wants to be, food secure if it wants to be. It has the global reserve currency. It has and probably will weaponize the dollar more in the future. Everybody wants to trade with the United States still. Europe doesn't have that same menu of options. So I think there is some of that volatility within individual European states. We just saw that with Poland. But Poland is sort of hardwired in. Like, they don't have a ton of choices. The path is relatively set for them, whereas the path is not set for the United States. The United States still has enough power and doesn't face any existential threats such that it has a lot more room. It has much fewer constraints than most countries do.
So the U.S. is basically the young rich kid who is going to go to law school, and then he's going to go to business school, and then maybe he's going to study furniture making, and he's going to go to Bali and find himself, and has plenty of resources to have all sorts of big picture questions about which major direction to go in. Is that a fair analogy?
I would tweak the analogy just a little bit to say the kid is not in school anymore. He or she graduated. They has a trust fund that it knows it can rely on, knows that nobody's going to, if everything falls apart in its face, he or she knows that they're going to be fine. And has been told their entire life that they were going to be the best. They were going to be the richest. They were going to be the most powerful. So now they've graduated and they're like, great, we're here. Like, we're here to be the richest and the most powerful. And not everybody is listening. We're probably spending too much time in the United States because some of the other things about the APEC summit around the edges really do support the more sort of nuts and bolts of the multipolar world that we're talking about. In some ways, I think it was much more important that the United States was talking about a limited free trade agreement with Indonesia. And the Indonesian president and Biden met on the sidelines of the conference and talked about upgrading their relationship. That's a huge deal. Listeners know that I've been talking about how Indonesia is a super important country that nobody's talking about for a long time, has mineral resources that everybody critically needs. And you saw that move forward. You saw Xi Jinping and the Japanese Prime Minister Kishida met on the sidelines of OPEC and talked about how they wanted to maintain better trade relations, even in the context of their worsening geopolitical relationship. I mean, it's an incredible juxtaposition. In the last week or two, Japan has been sending or promising that it's going to send naval craft to the Philippines Coast Guard and to the Bangladeshi Navy because it wants to build up capacity for these powers to resist China. And yet at the same time, Kishida and Xi are shaking hands and saying, hey, we really need to work together in terms of trade and economics, because if we don't, both of us are not going to do very well. So you can sort of see along the edges here how all of these different powers are trying to balance that. And I guess for me, that the reason that I'm sorry to keep going back to this, but I think multipolarity is here. I think it's the top-down geopolitical trend that is not going to change. And the problem that I see in the United States is that the United States doesn't recognize that it's here. It doesn't want to see it. And it's behaving as if it's in a unipolar world when it really is in a multipolar world. And the United States can still be an incredibly powerful country, but it cannot be everything to all people. It cannot support Taiwan and Ukraine and Israel and do everything else that the Biden administration has committed itself to and not completely run out of steam. So,
and within the U.S. itself, do you think that changes based on time and gravity, or do we need some sort of catalyst to make us realize that we're not able to play the same role globally that we did in the unipolar world, sort of like a Suez crisis kind of event, or is that too drastic?
Well, I think that's also, something that you said that was pretty insightful. I don't think the median American voter thinks about these things that much. Sure, I still see Ukrainian flags flying outside of some houses when I bike down the street in New Orleans. I did this morning. But I don't find that the median voter either has the care or attention to follow everything that's going on in the world. You and I are nerds. We're reading the newspaper with bated breath every day. We want to say, what's going on here? And Brazil just did this. Ethiopia just did this. Most people, they're not going there. And it's not out of their own laziness or ignorance. If you turn on CNN, all you're going to get is T-Swift. You're not going to get it. It actually takes some hard work to go underneath the surface and think about what's going on. I think it's also one of the reasons. I would really, maybe we'll put links to this in the show notes. The readouts from both the Chinese side and from the American side on the Xi Biden visit were really, really interesting. There's obviously some language that was coordinated between them, but there's also, very interesting differences between them and how they describe the bilateral relationship. For instance, I already talked about how the United States wants competition in there, and it wants to list all the things that they agreed to. We got military to military competition, and China agreed to do this on fentanyl. We established this working group, and Biden was really tough on Taiwan and blah, blah, blah. Whereas if you go read the Chinese readout, it's more ethereal. It's more about, we have to develop a perception about the direction of the relationship, and we have to manage disagreements effectively, and we have to find areas of mutually beneficial cooperation. And you could the dissonance is delicious, like watching the two sides try and talk to each other and make sense of each other, even though in some sense they're talking past each other. A deep sigh. Anything else you wanted? That was actually perfect. We did 30 minutes. Anything else you want to talk about with the U.S.-China, or do you want to move on to some investing implications or some market talk?
No, we can move on.
So this, the source of this is a tweet, and maybe we'll put a tweet in the show notes as well, but it's basically this guy, saying that he got different wealth management advisors to send him, 40 asset allocations from sort of leading wealth management groups in the world. And he looked, he put them in an Excel spreadsheet and he analyzed them all, and some had more equities, and some had more fixed income, and some were more aggressive, and some were least aggressive. And he basically concludes that the difference between the most and least aggressive portfolios was 0.53% a year. And his provocative conclusion is, and I'm quoting him here, this is Mel Faber if you want to look him up, but we'll put the tweet in the show notes, even though we're sort of making fun of him here. But, quote, "If you're a professional money manager, go spend your time on value-added activities like real estate planning, insurance, tax harvesting, prospecting, general time with your clients or family, or even golf." End quote. I pinged you immediately and said, shots fired, because we joke all the time that our entire thing is we're going to disrupt these wealth management guys who just go and play golf and don't actually do any research. So I don't know. I was like, oh, wow, okay, I need to get Rob's take on this, and I know that you have a take. So there's your grapefruit. Hit it out of the park.
Oh, geez. Our secret is everything just emerges from the fact that we're really self-conscious about that we suck at golf. But
whoa. You're the one who sucks at golf. I'm fine.
I didn't know that you played golf, Jacob. I thought you were a basketball man.
Well, I'm a man of many talents.
Wow,
you should know.
I've never heard of you playing golf. I'll have to check up on you more closely in the future.
You might want to hit the range first.
So in short, just to preview the take on this, I don't encourage advisors to go out and play golf. That's not where this is going to land here. No, but in all seriousness, and I don't want to pick on Meb. I think it's Meb Faber, because he seems like he's a pretty smart guy, and he puts out stuff that I've seen and liked in the past. But on the...
Oh, yeah. And to be clear, listeners, unless I explicitly say otherwise, if you're making it on the podcast, you made me think about something. It's a compliment. Even if we're going to disagree with you, like disagreement for me is a love language.
I guess the way that I would try to respond or describe this is all of this is about the parameters with which you're viewing this. Because he's correct. If you take the asset allocation, percentages of all these 40 different banks and just put them in a static thing, which they do, and then just let them run, there's not going to be a huge difference between them. Because it's just 100 different flavors. It's the Baskin Robbins of passive do nothing investing. It's all the same in the end. The question is not, is that active investing? Because what your asset allocation is doesn't matter. Like at the end of the day, what matters is the decisions that you make. And I guess the sort of what I would try to appeal to is people's intuition that it matters what you do along the way, that it matters what the environment is. And if you like someone like Warren Buffett, who I think has just an intuitive appeal to people, the way that he describes investing, buy when others are fearful, sell when they're greedy. Like these are timeless nuggets of wisdom, and they're timeless because there's great truth to them. The way that he's describing all of these 40 different asset allocation strategies is not that. That is, be long everything all the time, everywhere. And of course, that's really stupid. And it adds no value to just do that with little tweaks at the margin of a little bit more of this, a little bit more of that. The trick is to have the wherewithal and the research and the discipline to say, hey, now is the time to make a real move to buy or to sell or to, you're underwriting these risks actively, or you're just, a lemming and you're just putting it on autopilot. And that worked for a very long time, which is why you have 40 different asset allocation models where, maybe they're tweaking it by 3% at the margin because they're making this big bet on equities. In the end, it's window dressing. It doesn't matter. I guess if you were to take a historical example, what if, in 2007, you turned around and said, hey, you know what? Things are really looking very risky, and I'm going to take a bunch of money off the table because things are expensive and I don't see any opportunities. If you had missed, the worst month in 2009, you would have made your 2 decades in terms of returns. Like that's how much equities move around. And you see these statistics going around that like, if you had missed the 3 worst down days of the last 30 years, your annualized return would be 10 percentage points higher or something crazy like that. And it's true. And of course, you're not going to get them all right. But the point is, there's such enormous low-hanging fruit there. And just doing basic blocking and tackling and intuitive stuff, that you don't need to get them all right to have good results over time. What you have to do is not do nothing and not accept that a good advisor, a good steward of your wealth is going to say, oh yeah, let's do nothing. That's I'm going to go play golf now and do your taxes while, we let your assets just run off loose on, the equivalent of the Tesla self-driving autopilot and, go in the fast lane of the highway. Like not a good strategy. So yeah, that's my take.
Well, and I think there's an important differentiation too, because I think you're actually wrong to call it stupid. Like buy and hold, like if you buy and hold for the long term, you're going to be better than if you kept the money underneath your mattress, right? But part of what he says is he talks about how when you're overlaying 1% or even higher management fees on these passive strategies and things like that, that's why you should go out and play golf. And I think there's 2 differences there. I think if you want to do the buy and hold thing, you can do that without paying 1% or 2% management fees. You probably shouldn't pay those management fees if that's what you want to express as a thesis. And over the last 30 years, that actually probably worked. And if you think the United States is going back to unipolar power land, or even if you think we're going to a bipolar, like, you can make the argument for why that case is there. Our case has always been, well, first of all, like, the management fee is because we're active. We're literally sitting here all day. I haven't been able to play golf in months because we're sitting here all day talking about, our research calls about interest rates and about Brazilian government bonds and things like that, because that's the thing that sort of gives us edge. And that is what you get for that. And we also think as we enter this multipolar world, that you're going to want to be more active. That some of the passive allocations, there will be companies that are wiped out by some of the changes that are happening in the energy space. We were talking about utilities in our research call just before we got on here. We didn't reach any conclusions. We reached the realization that we're in the cave and have ignorance. We have to start a major project on it. Like, that's where we're spending our time. So I guess I would just say, if you want to do the buy low passive thing, that's great. Like, just don't pay an asset manager who's charging you a fee to go play golf and give you those products, if that's the route that you want to go. There's a very clear differentiation to me here between the active and passive and how we talk.
Yeah, and there's also, I don't know how much outsiders really pick up on this, but there's sort of this this narrative of kind of encouraging people to feel super smart for not paying for anything. And that's fine, as you say, if you're just going to put your money in the market and walk away for 25 years, you can do that for very cheap, and that's a totally valid option. But what you see more and more in financial services is people are kind of bragging, or they're trying to offer solutions, and the whole value proposition is, oh, well, we can do nothing for less than the other guy does nothing. And because there's really so little value there, and because it's being disintermediated by purely passive investing, that's where advisors are trying to shift the narrative. And that's my big beef with this, is the whole notion of like, well, maybe we shouldn't do passive. That's not even in the conversation in the mainstream. The mainstream conversation is, well, how clever are you going to be in automating your stuff for as cheaply as possible to do nothing for as cheap as you can get it. So that's problematic, and I think it sort of avoids what most people would find just intuitively very obvious, which is that you should do something. It pays to think rather than not think. It pays to be thoughtful and try to prepare and do commonsensical moves rather than to not do that.
Yeah, there's two things I want to say in response to that, and they're both about the psychology of investors. And this is probably global, but I can only speak about it from an American context. The first is that you already mentioned Warren Buffett, and in some ways, they're not quite celebrities in the same way that athletes and singers and artists are. But I feel like the most successful investors have become celebrities in a way, and that there are people out there who want to be them and want to feel like they're as good. So I was on a flight a couple of weeks ago with a guy who, he'd already had a couple before I even sat down next to him, and he had a few more throughout the course of the flight and spilled one all over my seat at some point. So I got beer all over my pants. The flight attendant, as I was leaving, grabbed my arm and said, "You are a saint for not complaining. I just put however many miles in your account. Thank you for being so nice." So I was like, yeah, great. Anyway, so as he's, downing his drinks, he's like, all right, I told him, he asked me what I do. I told him what I do. He's like, oh, interesting. Okay, I have my own construction company. What stock should I buy to make 80% return in the next 12 months? And I was like, dude, anybody who answers that question, you shouldn't be listening to in the first place. And he was like, oh, okay, because I went all in on Tesla, and I think you should look at Tesla. Tesla's really good. And I'm sort of joking, but I can't tell you how many times I've had that interaction with people who are like, oh, I got this tip, or oh, I sold this stock, and I'm really, really smart because then it went down, 5% over the next week or two or something. That's Warren Buffett doesn't do that. As you said, the whole thing about Warren Buffett is he buys and then he doesn't really touch. How long has he held Coca-Cola? How long has he held American Express? He's not out here bragging about how he sold it off before it went down for a week. That's the wrong approach. So I think there's something in people's minds that they want to do the investing thing, but they don't have the sort of supernatural patience and discipline you need if that's the strategy that you want to use. But the second thing, your thing about lower prices and people being proud of paying lower prices for things. This is something I've been thinking a lot about in the context of agriculture and food in general. I was in Minneapolis last week. I was speaking at Minnesota Agri-Growth. And one of the things I said there was the American consumer has gotten really accustomed to paying nothing for food. Food is incredibly cheap. And it's weird because is there anything more important to our health and to our bodies? I had a cute fight with my wife the other day where she brought home the less nice eggs from the store. And I was like, get the nice eggs. Like I'm willing to pay $1 or $2 more for the nicer eggs. And you juxtapose this with, I'm forgetting where the study was, but I'll find it. But they found that, Americans have been making up for lost time since the pandemic, taking 2 and 3 vacations in the past sort of 12 months rather than just one because they want to go out and do this. And I have anecdotal evidence of that happening as well. And it's just like, I would rather have the nice eggs for 365 days a year and take one less nice vacation. Like that's where you should be doing the thing. But we do have this thing where in some ways the things that are most important to us are the things we expect to pay the cheapest for. I'm pretty sure it's David Hume. I think it's David Hume who has a whole, I can't remember its Hume. I'll go back and find it, but I think it's Hume. A discussion about how, or no, maybe it's kind of, I'll find it. But the topic is about water and how water is the most critical thing to human existence. And yet we expect water to be free. We expect to turn on the faucet and we expect it to be there. There's something uncivilized if you can't have water for free. And yet if we were in Mad Max Fury Road and we were all competing for water, water would probably become the most precious resource. And there's something psychological about how that works. And it works here too. I would be willing to pay someone more for a good service if it's a really, really important service. Think about, I just had to update my will because we just had Annie a year ago and I felt like I had to do that. I don't want the cheap lawyer for that. I'll pay a little extra for the good lawyer so that the will is good so she doesn't have to deal with that shit if anything happens down the road. But that's not the mentality of.
Yeah, I think it's hard because just getting to your first point about the mentality of people, once you become, how do I say, most people don't have the mental sort of makeup to do that well. A lot of people want to be Warren Buffett, and it's really hard. And what he does isn't so special. It's sort of a discipline and sort of mentality more than he's such a, intellectually brilliant, genius human being. But once you get into having to make decisions, then, I described, I think 2 weeks ago, talking about interest rates and Powell and everything, I described markets as 2 mirrors pointing at each other forever, right? And once you enter that world, it's very difficult because it really does. I always thought I've said this before, but I'll say it again because it's this important. I always thought the most profound thing that anyone's ever said about markets was in the first Market Wizards book, which if you haven't read is very good. And I think it was Ed Seykota, I forget who said it exactly. This came out in the 80s, and he said, everyone gets what they really want out of markets, which sounds really glib. And when I first read it at the start of my career, I was like, yeah, whatever, okay. But then, as you go through time and you see how people blow themselves up, you see how they make wrong decisions, and these issues, they reflect not a problem with the markets, it reflects themselves and what they're really trying to get out of the markets. Some people are gamblers. Some people just want to be viewed as really, really smart. Very few people actually go into the markets wanting to do what we think the markets are for, to successfully and invest and get an adequate return that you're happy with. It's like that mirror. It's like the Harry Potter mirror where he goes and he sits and he looks at it and you see what you want to see. And that is that's a labyrinth that a lot of people struggle with, especially professionals, because they tend to have the biggest egos and the most delusions about why and what they're doing. So, there's no question that it's not easy, but it's certainly worthwhile, I guess, because the alternative is just pack up and leave, and keep your money under the mattress.
Yeah, or buy gold or Bitcoin or apparently Tesla stock from the guy who was sitting next to me on the flight. I didn't tell you this story for a couple of weeks because he threatened to listen to the podcast and write to me directly. So I didn't want to tell the story on the off chance that he was going to listen and say, hey, don't you? But I don't think he probably didn't even remember. I'm sure he doesn't even remember any part of the conversation. So I feel safe talking about it now. And if you're listening, I haven't heard from you. Let me know if you want to spill a drink on this. Anyway, anything else you want to talk about, Rob, before we get out of here?
No, why don't we cut it off there and get cranking?
I'm not sure if we'll have a Thanksgiving episode next week, but on the off chance that we don't, just two other things to keep in mind. Argentina has elections this weekend. If Milei wins, you'll probably get an emergency pod for me on Monday or Tuesday just to talk about what the chainsaw is going to do to the Argentine economy. And last but not least, it's been a pretty eventful week in Spain. They had hundreds of thousands of protests in Madrid because the Socialist Party there made a deal with Catalan separatists for some amnesty in return for helping them forge a government. And it's funny, I haven't really done much with Spain and the Catalonia issue for years, but we've got some interesting analysis on the Knowledge platform. And if it has any legs, we'll obviously address it here. Also, we've had a couple listeners reach out and ask about Panama, Rob. So here's my note to myself. You and I need to talk about Panama sometime because all these little choke points that are super important in the world that nobody talks about. All right, we've got 15 minutes before we have to go jump on with a client. Maybe I'll go do some putting in the corner here before we get there. Thank you so much for listening to the Cognitive Dissidents podcast brought to you by Cognitive Investments. If you are interested in learning more about cognitive investments, you can check us out online at cognitive.investments. That's cognitive.investments. You can also write to me directly if you want at jacob@cognitive.investments. Cheers, and we'll see you out there. The views expressed in this commentary are subject to change based on market and other conditions. This podcast may contain certain statements that may be deemed forward-looking statements. Please note that any such statements are not guarantees of any future performance, and actual results or developments may differ materially from those projected. Any projections, market outlooks, or estimates are based upon certain assumptions and should not be construed as indicative of actual events that will occur. Cognitive Investments LLC is a registered investment advisor. Advisory services are only offered to clients or prospective clients where Cognitive and its representatives are properly licensed or exempt from licensure. For additional information, please visit our website at www.cognitive.investments. The information provided is for educational and informational purposes only and does not constitute investment advice, and it should not be relied on as such. It should not be considered a solicitation to buy or an offer to sell a security. It does not take into account any investor's particular investment objectives, strategies, tax status, or investment horizon. You should consult your attorney or tax advisor.